Hi, this is Mr. Miller, guest teaching for Mr. Swayze. We're going to go over clauses and phrases today. So, with clauses, there are two types of clauses. You have dependent clauses and independent clauses. So, dependent clauses contain a subject and a verb, but they cannot make a complete sentence on their own. They depend on an independent clause to exist. Dependent clauses usually start with a subordinator, which we'll go over on the next slide. Independent clauses contain a subject and verb and can make their own complete sentences, and they express complete ideas. Dependent clauses function to add important details to sentences. They let you put ideas, phrases, and clauses together. Subordinators are words that shift independent clauses into dependent clauses. So using words like after, although, as, because, before, and so on can set up a dependent clause. Your example, it's polite to mute your cell phone while eating dinner with others. While eating dinner with others is the dependent clause that adds the important detail of when to mute your cell phone. Independent clauses express clear ideas, have subjects and verbs, and they make their own complete sentences. Examples are, I get tired, I walk quickly, or Nomar Garcia Parra is my favorite Red Sox shortstop. Combining independent and dependent clauses is what good writing's all about. Your dependent clauses will start with a subordinator, and they can come before or after the independent clause. So if you use a dependent clause before the independent clause, you need to put a comma between the clauses. And let's take a look at some examples. Using dependent clauses first, if I stay up late playing video games, I get tired. When I'm running late to class, I walk quickly. Even though Xander Bogaerts is talented, Nomar Garcia Parra is my favorite Red Sox shortstop. And it's important to note here the comma placement right at the end of the dependent clause. So you can say the same exact thing in each of these sentences by putting the dependent clause second. If I get tired if I stay up late playing video games. I walk quickly when I'm running late to class. Nomar Garcia Parra is my favorite Red Sox shortstop, even though Xander Bogaerts is talented. So notice that we don't need a comma in between the independent clause, the subordinator, and the rest of the dependent clause when the dependent clause comes second. Does it matter if I use a dependent clause before or after the independent clause? The answer is no. It does not matter. So either way works. Either before or after the independent clause is grammatically correct. If you're a talented writer, you will switch up your sentence structure throughout a piece of writing so that it's not the same independent to dependent clause second every single time. If you're a dynamic writer, you use varied sentence structure, and you alternate between having dependent clauses before or after independent clauses. It takes some practice to figure out what sounds and feels best in your writing. Really, the switch is all about what feels right, what sounds better when you read it back to yourself, and what keeps your writing fresh, what keeps it dynamic instead of being boring and static. So on the left, we have an example of static writing. This is going to be dependent clause second in every single sentence. Mr. Miller often enjoys playing video games after he gets his work done. He mostly plays PS4 even though he owns a Switch. His favorite game right now is Elite Dangerous because Warzone was getting boring. Breath of the Wild was his favorite before Warzone and Elite came out. And then in the dynamic writing, this shifts some of the sentences to dependent clause first. It's important to alternate, so don't just use dependent clauses first because it looks fancier. If you end up using that method every single time, it makes your writing static even though it seems like it's better from a quick look. After he gets his work done, Mr. Miller often enjoys playing video games. Even though he owns a Switch, he mostly plays PS4. His favorite game right now is Elite Dangerous because Warzone was getting boring. Before Warzone and Elite came out, Breath of the Wild was his favorite. So even just the sound of those two pieces, the static is just a little bit more dull and monotonous, and dynamic, it pops more. Common errors using dependent clauses. The one that I see most as a teacher when I read through is when a dependent clause tries to be its own sentence. If you try to use a dependent clause on its own, you end up with an incomplete sentence, and it just needs a little bit of revision. So sometimes a subordinator is used to start a sentence, it never gets where it's going, and becomes an incomplete sentence. Our incorrect version. There are often times when your cell phone should go on mute, like at dinner or when you're at the movies. So this almost sounds like the way that we would talk. Oftentimes when we're having conversations, we don't follow the same rules of written grammar. But written out should go like this. There are often times when your cell phone should go on mute, like at dinner or when you're at the movies. These two are almost exactly the same. The big difference is your commas. You're using commas to show that you're using dependent clauses, and then it all runs together as one complete complex sentence. So let's talk about phrases. There are three common types of phrases: participle phrases, absolute phrases, and appositive phrases. Participle phrases add descriptions to nouns and pronouns. They work as adjectives even though they look like they're actions. They are set off by commas and, like dependent clauses, can come before or after the nouns and pronouns that they modify. Adding phrases and varying their position in your sentences makes your writing more dynamic. So let's take a look at some without participle phrases. The Phantom Menace has terrible acting. Terry had no place to go. With participle phrases, The Phantom Menace, considered the worst film in the Star Wars saga, has terrible acting. Running out of room, Terry had no place to go. Again, notice your commas setting off this participle phrase. These function to tell you a little bit more about the subject. So The Phantom Menace, considered the worst film, by me. I did end up rewatching this movie for the first time in, I can't tell you how many years. It's been at least 15 years since I've seen this movie. It was still pretty bad. I had to kind of put myself through it because I set myself the goal of rewatching the whole Star Wars saga. And this is the one I dreaded. But this participle phrase adds more detail to the Phantom Menace, and it spices up the writing. It makes it seem a lot more academic and professional. Next type of phrases are absolute phrases. An absolute phrase contains just a noun and a participle. A participle is a word with an ed or ing ending that describes a noun. They require commas when offset from the rest of the sentence. And they are a lot like the participle phrases. They're shorter. There's just a noun and participle. Let's take a look at some examples without an absolute phrase. The baby robin was flying free and finally left its nest. Mike tried to call for help as he breathlessly entered the room. We celebrated joyfully, and her birthday was a success. With an absolute phrase, flying free, the baby robin finally left its nest. Mike, breathlessly entering, tried to call for help. Her birthday was a success, celebrated joyfully. So notice that the difference between these two versions of pretty much the same sentence is that you take this absolute phrase of flying free, make it its own phrase, and start the sentence with flying free. So this way, the emphasis of this sentence is about the freedom of the moment, flying free, instead of starting with the baby robin. Really, it's saying the same thing. A robin flies free and leaves its nest, but with this absolute phrase as the starter, like this sentence just sounds and seems better. It's more emphatic. It really puts the emphasis on what you're trying to say. So, to complicate things, you can really put an absolute phrase uh, almost anywhere in the sentence. They work like adjectives, but with adjectives, we usually put them before our nouns. This can come after. So if you imagine this phrase, this sentence as the baby robin, comma, flying free, comma, finally left its nest. Or even at the end, the baby robin finally left its nest, comma, flying free. So you have a lot of different options for where to put your absolute phrases, and really it just takes practice and time to see what sounds right, what feels right with where you're putting these phrases in your sentences. And last are appositive phrases. They add details to other nouns. They're similar to participle phrases, but appositive phrases work as nouns as a sentence. They often start with a, an, or the, so your indefinite and definite articles. Let's take a look at some examples with no appositive phrase. Ewan McGregor played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Phantom Menace. Lester had a successful transition to playing football. Volkswagen tried to redeem itself. Adding appositive phrases will help add detail to the nouns. So the noun in our first sentence, Ewan McGregor, we're going to add more detail. Ewan McGregor, a famous Scottish actor, played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Phantom Menace. A skilled rugby player, Lester had a successful transition to football. Volkswagen, a company marred by controversy, tried to redeem itself. So each of these appositive phrases go back and tell you more about the nouns that they modify. So this tells you that Lester, a skilled rugby player, was successfully transitioning to football. Volkswagen, it tells you more about the noun, a company marred by controversy, tried to redeem itself. So what's the point? Why do we bother with phrases, clauses, changing up order? It makes your writing better. It adds, adding dependent clauses and phrases to your sentences gives your writing more depth. It gives it more detail. Varying sentence structure makes your writing flow better and can add emphasis where you need it. And adding rhythm to your writing using phrases or clauses, while it seems complicated, is actually quite easy with practice. The more you write, the more risks you take with trying to include complex sentences in your writing, the better you'll get as a writer. So I try to have my students do writing every single day, even during this corona closure. I hope that you guys are writing a lot in your English classes. Knowing Mr. Swayze, I know that you guys are doing some serious writing and some great grammar instruction. This is just one little sample of a grammar/writing lesson. I hope to see some of you students in the fall when we get back. Maybe in a year or two, you will enter my classroom and we can talk more about writing. But for now, it was a pleasure being your guest teacher, and I hope you guys have a great summer.